All right, so we've talked about observation and inferences, and as I mentioned before, those are just like the first steps into the scientific method, or just into being a scientist in general, right? So now let's go into a little bit further into the scientific method, past the observations and inferences. So, like it says right here, the scientific method is a ultimate problem solving. If you know how to use the scientific method, then there's almost there aren't very many problems you can't solve, right? And again, this also goes into your employment. So um, just some steps of the scientific method. The first one is observation. So we talked about this, right? You observe something, and then you come up with some questions, and these questions are what's going to help you get to your inference, right? And in this case, your inference is going to be called a hypothesis. And we talked about this just briefly earlier. And the hypothesis is just basically an educated guess, right? A prediction that you make based off of all the information that you have, which is just like an inference, right? And then once you make that inference, right, you hypothesize something is going to happen. And it's not enough just to say, I think this is what's going to happen. You actually have to run an experiment and test your hypothesis to see if your hypothesis was supported or if it was not supported, right? And then you collect the data. And once you do your experiment, collect the data, you make graphs, you make tables, things like that. You type up some papers. And then afterwards, you come up with a conclusion. So it was just basically when you talk about the conclusion, it's just something saying like, well, the data showed that my hypothesis was not supported. So it wasn't true. Or you could say that my hypothesis was supported, which means it was backed up by the experiment, right? And then it's always important to retest. You never just want to go with the first result. You always want to retest to make sure it wasn't just like a one time thing, right? So let's look at these steps in more detail. So, as we talked about earlier, observations, remember, observations just have to do with your senses, right? Things that you gather through your senses, that you witness through your senses. So, a scientist notices something in their natural world, right? That's usually the first step of a scientific discovery, is that you just notice something is going on in the world and you're just like, well, why is this happening? Right? You call those natural phenomenons, right? And you try to explain why they're happening. And so, again, first step is you observe these. So, an example of an observation might be noticing that many salamanders near a pond have a curved, not straight tails, right? And salamanders are supposed to have straight tails. So, you kind of notice this phenomenon like, why do these salamanders have curved tails and not straight tails, right? So, it's just like the first step right there, observing something. And so then you come up with a hypothesis. A hypothesis, again, is just kind of like an inference that you're going to make based upon all the information that you have. So the really important thing about a hypothesis, though, is that it has to be testable, right? You can't just say something like, "Oh, it's magic. Magic is the reason why their tails are curved." Well, we don't have tests for magic, right? There's not really anything, any way you can experiment on something to test that magic, right? So it has to be based on like logic and evidence and just like sound proof. And so it must be testable. And sometimes when they're written, these are keywords we're going to see later in an assignment. When you see the words if and then, that's a good indication that this is a hypothesis, because a hypothesis is basically saying like cause and effect. If this happens, then this is going to happen, right? So if it's thundering outside and it's very humid outside, then it's going to rain, right? It may not be 100% true, but that's what a hypothesis is, cause and effect. If this, then this is going to happen. And they don't necessarily have to have the words if and then, but it will be cause and effect. And we'll see some examples later, right? So hypothesis tries to predict an outcome. Based off of all the information you have, you're going to try to predict what is going to happen in your experiment. Right, so an example of a hypothesis about the salamanders might be that the salamanders have curved tails due to a pollutant in the moist soil where they live. Right. So this hypothesis is based on some information, like, for example, salamanders. Their skin is very sensitive, and whenever their environment is polluted, they are very quick to be affected by it. Right. So that is, something that this person may know about salamanders, or maybe the salamanders are near this like plastic factory or some factory that makes toxic chemicals. And so, you got to take all this into account. And then based off of that, you make that hypothesis that maybe it's the pollutant in the moist soil that is making their tails curved. Right? And so now that you made your hypothesis, now you have to do the experiment. So an experiment, if you're doing an experiment out in nature, it's a lot harder to control just because you have all these other factors to take into account. So, a lot of times it's not ideal to do these experiments out in nature. But if you have the example like the salamanders, you kind of have to go out there and do them, right? So, an example of an experiment for the salamanders would be like just taking samples of the salamander. So, just observing salamanders that are in other different environments, maybe not next to a factory, and then maybe looking at the one that is next to a factory. Maybe try to find similar factories that have salamanders nearby and see if their tails are curved, right? So you got to test these your hypothesis by checking the salamanders and their environment, maybe testing the soil and seeing what kind of pollutants are there, and then maybe just drawing some blood from the salamander and testing to see if maybe they've got lead or some other kind of metal or something, some kind of toxic chemical in their system. Right, so this is how you would do it out in nature. But usually, if you want something to be really well controlled, you want to do it in a lab, right? So in this case right here, we see the scientist, he's in a lab. And when you do that, you can control for a lot of other different things when you're testing your hypothesis. So remember, you test your hypothesis with an experiment. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's so many different variables or factors that come into play when you're doing an experiment. And so, as a scientist, you want to try to control for as many as possible. Again, when you're in nature, sometimes you can't help it, you have to go out there. But when that happens, there are so many other things that can affect the results of an experiment. So, when we're talking about variables, there are quite a few different types of variables when it comes to experimenting. And well, as I mentioned, that if you're going to have a good experiment, a good something that's very reliable, you want to try to have an experiment that only has one changing variable, right? So again, if you're testing for why the pollutants is affecting the salamander, you want to make sure that you're just focusing on the pollutants, right? You don't want to really worry about diet or other things like that. So you're just trying to focus on the one thing. So before we get into controls and variables, an example of like an experiment we're having to do with pharmaceuticals, right? Medication. If you're trying to test something on like cholesterol, so you're trying to give a pill for cholesterol and you're trying to create that medication, you want everyone to be as exactly as close to each other as possible. So you want like the same gender and the same age group, and so that nothing else is affecting it, or you're trying to control for as much to not affect it except for the one thing that you're trying to experiment on. And in this case, it would be like the medication for cholesterol. Right. So again, some more controls and variables, a little bit more information on that. Remember that you want to just try to reduce all the other variables except the one thing that you're testing. Right. So an experimenter changes one factor and observes or measures what happens. Then you got to do it just one at a time, one factor at a time, because then you don't know what is causing the results of an experiment, right? If you're changing everything at the same time. So just try to focus on one factor and decide if it's that one thing that is causing this, the results of the experiment.